Clients. Are they really worth it? Hey guys, welcome back to the shop. I do a few client projects or commission pieces each year, and each time I submit the quote, I feel like the Burning Man from the cover of one of my favorite Pink Floyd album covers. Clients can sometimes be a real pain in the butt, and sometimes an absolute joy to work with. Admittedly, my favorites are the ones that allow me to create what I want, but still fit their needs. In this case, the client sent me a very elaborate picture of a table with wraparound bench seating and integrated with a kitchen island, and all in a farmhouse style. Unfortunately, their budget and my time just wasn't there for the entire elaborate setup, so we agreed to just start with the table. This would allow us both to work with each other and decide if there would be more work in the future. I jumped into SketchUp to try to find a jumping off point with a fairly simple trestle table design. Since this isn't quite Farmhouse, I assumed that this would simply be the first of many drawings to come. I didn't include any joinery in the drawing. The purpose of the drawing is just for a good visual representation of the piece with accurate dimensions to give the client a good look at the finished project, as well as keep me on track in the shop. There are so many ways to do joinery that I often make those decisions as the piece is being made. I was pretty amazed when this client approved the very first drawing I created. We did get together a couple of times to discuss some design and finishing details, but I'll talk more about those later as these details are added. The plan is for a painted base and an African mahogany top. The client opted to do the painting to keep costs down, and it certainly didn't hurt my feelings. I'll have a little finishing work on the base, but I'll talk more about that towards the end of the video. So with all that backstory and most of this rough milling out of the way, I think it's time to build the base. So here's the breakdown of the three parts needed to complete the legs. The feet, the center section, and the upper table support. We're going to start with that center section, and I'm going to cut my blank here in half. Since the table base is going to be painted, this just makes it much easier to get a perfect mortise for the center stretcher. By adding some 1-inch strips, carefully hitting my layout marks and gluing them back up, I create a perfect mortise in the center section. From there I can go back to the table saw and remove that little extra bits of the spacers that I put in there. Then off to the joiner to make one side completely flat. And then of course back over to the planer to bring everything down to its final thickness. So next I created the templates for all the curves. I'm using the Veritas drawing bow here for that. And then of course off to the bandsaw to get all of these rough cut. And of course there's lots of sanding involved to get these to their final shape. So with the piece still square, I used the dado stack to create a perfectly centered 1/2-inch tenon on each end. I purposely left these a little heavy to allow each one to be fit to their mortises in the upper rail and the bottom feet. And since the fence is still set perfectly good, I went ahead and used the same setup to locate the shoulder cuts for the tenons, and I nipped those off at the bandsaw. Moving on to the upper table support in the feet, I used the router to create the mortises to accept the tenons. As usual, I used dual edge guides and set stops to prevent any mistakes. I really like the turret stops for taking smaller bites and ending up at a perfect depth. With the mortises cut, I went back to the tenons to ensure that each one was thickness to fit the mortise. I was careful to remove the same amount from each side of the tenon so that it remained centered. Lots of test fits and trial and error. Rather than squaring up the mortises, I chose to round off the tenons to fit. I used a flush trim saw and chisels at the bottom of the tenon so that I didn't damage the shoulders, and a rasp at the top to finish rounding over the tenon. Again, I made several test fits, trying to only remove as much material as needed to fit the tenon. As each tenon was fit to a mortise, I marked them because that tenon was fit to that specific mortise. With everything fitting properly, I used the templates I created earlier to mark all the curve cuts and then cut them out at the bandsaw. Then it was off to the disc sander to clean up all of the outside curves. And the spindle sander to clean up all of the inside curves. There's still a fair share of hand sanding to do, but I do that as each part is finished up, so I have less sanding to do later. So with most of the sanding done, I went ahead and put a 1/8 inch roundover bit in the palm router and did all the roundovers everywhere I could. And then I will final sand these pieces to about 180. So all of this effort really paid off here, as this glue up actually went really smooth. I cleaned up any squeeze out while the glue was wet here because it would actually be harder in these tight spots once the glue has cured. I didn't want to damage the roundovers because it was such a small reveal from that leg to that center section. So with these glued up and in clamps, it was time for the long table supports that will connect the legs at the top. I ripped these to final width and then used the domino to cut the mortises for the floating tenons. I used two 8x50 dominoes at each end, which should provide plenty of support for these pieces. And I promise, this is the only time you'll see the domino in this project. Now it's time for what will be the first of many dry fits. This dry fit is extremely important so that I can get the actual measurement for the shoulders on the center stretcher. This is one of those places where following a plan can get you into trouble by creating unsightly gaps or out of square legs. With my measurements in hand, I used a test piece the same thickness as the center stretcher to set up the dado stack to cut tenons on the center stretcher. This took a couple of changes to sneak up on the perfect fit. Again, I left this one just a little heavy so I could use a hand plane or sander and dial in the fit absolutely perfectly. With a good fit on the test piece, I cut the tenons on the actual stretcher. I know this looks like I'm breaking every rule in the book at the table saw. Miter gauge and fence typically should not be used together, but in this case, I'm removing such a small amount that I was comfortable with doing it. I purposely made these tenons extra long so that I had plenty of room for the tusk mortises that still have to be cut. I'll trim these tenons later, and as you can see, the fits came out pretty good. Just as I did with all the other parts in the base, I created a template for the center stretcher. I used the template to mark the center stretcher, but since this is a one-off piece for this project and I'm not going to flush trim with it, I could have probably just marked the actual workpiece and skipped this template altogether. Next up was cutting the mortises for the tusks. I set up at the hollow chisel mortiser with a 3/8 inch bit, which was just long enough to reach all the way through. Once the leg side wall was cut, I angled the stretcher in the mortiser to get about a 7-degree angle and cut the rest of the mortise. The angle isn't critical, but it's important to remember the angle later so that it can be applied to the tusks. After cutting the tenons to final length with the miter saw, I chamfered the ends of the tenons with a palm router and a chamfer bit, and then finally got back over to the bandsaw to cut the curve. From there it was on to lots of more hand sanding and applying the roundovers with the same bit that I used from all of the legs. And after all these details are finally done, it's time to glue up the base. As usual, I start by gluing in the dominoes first. This just eliminates one step in a complex glue up. I moved it to the floor and raised the legs so that the through tenon could go in all the way without hitting the floor. After gluing all the pieces for the bottom leg, or the leg that's on the floor, I applied glue to the other ends and installed the other leg for the final time. I then moved the whole thing back up to the table and applied clamps and checked for any gaps and took care of any squeeze out that might be there. With the base curing in clamps, I turned my attention to the tusks. I started with a 1/4 inch piece of scrap plywood to get the angle and shape that I wanted, and then used that as the template for the actual African mahogany tusks. I cut these out at the bandsaw and finessed the shape at the disc sander before finally getting a test fit to see how they would actually look on this base. And I have to say, I think those look pretty good. With the base glued up except for paint, it was time to go to work on the top. After spending a considerable amount of time deciding how I wanted the boards laid out, I trimmed the ends off, leaving them a little long still. This just reduced the weight and made it a little easier to handle as I went through the final milling process. I was pretty fortunate that these boards really didn't move much after the initial milling, and they had sat for quite a while. So it was on to the final milling and then cleaning up the joints in preparation for this glue up. These boards actually sat really nice and flat in my clamps, so I didn't see any need for any alignment aids such as the domino or dowels or anything along those lines. Just a straightforward long grain to long grain glue up that went pretty smooth. And you can see on the ends of the boards how I marked each board to ensure that I got it back in the correct location and the correct orientation. I did go ahead and add some extra clamps at the joints as well as some clamping cauls just to keep the odds in my favor. Once out of clamps, it was just a matter of sanding through the grits to get the top nice and smooth. I did mark this up with a white pencil before sanding so that I could see where I sanded and where I didn't as I worked through those grits. For what it's worth, this is the Rotex that I'm using, but it's just in normal sander mode. As luck would have it, I knocked over one of my light stands and put a pretty significant dent in the top. Fortunately, it was just a dent and fairly easy to repair using an iron and a wet rag to steam the fibers back into place. After a little sanding, you couldn't even see where the dent was. After cutting the top to final dimension, it was time to start laying out for the tenon that would take the breadboard in. I used the router and an edge guide to remove the material equally from each side, leaving a centered tenon. Of course, this was done on both ends of the top. From there, it was on to the actual breadboard end. Again, I have the router set up with dual edge guides and just taking a little bit at a time until the mortises are cut to full depth. With the mortises cut, I went back to the tenons to trim the ends. I used a chisel to clean up the shoulders, and of course a square to check it often to make sure that I was staying on line. And just like with the legs, I decided to round these tenons rather than squaring the mortises in the breadboard ends. Next, it was over to the drill press to drill the peg holes in the breadboards, being careful not to drill all the way through the bottom as we didn't want them to show on the bottom. I then clamped the breadboards back in place and marked the hole locations on the tenons using the same drill bit that I used to drill the breadboards. With the location marked on the tenon, I moved the actual hole location slightly towards the shoulder of the tenon. This will produce a draw bore and keep the joint tight over time. The two outer holes on each side of center were elongated side to side to allow for seasonal wood movement. It's important that these are elongated only side to side and not front to back. To install the breadboard ends, I applied glue to only the center section. I was super happy with how this breadboard end fit. Next, I installed the center wingy peg with glue. The outer pegs were installed next, only applying glue to the very top portion of the peg. This would ensure that the peg would be able to move seasonally in the elongated holes. I then flush trimmed the pegs at the top and made sure the clamps were tight and let this one sit overnight. Again, I made a template to ensure that the curves were the same on each side. With my lines marked, I used the jigsaw to cut the curves just close to my line. I then used CA glue and blue painter's tape to secure the template to the top so that I could flush trim this curve. I used a small flush trim bit to start to create that perfect edge. With the initial flush trim done, I removed the template and used the initial cut to finish the flush trimming on the rest of the side. All four sides were completed exactly the same way. To complete the profile on the top, I rounded over the top edges using a 1/4 inch roundover bit. To create the large chamfer on the bottom, I started by marking guidelines for where I wanted the chamfer to be. I then used the powered hand planer to remove the bulk of the material, getting as close as I could to my layout lines. I then finished these off with both powered sanders and hand sanders to finish up the chamfers, making sure the corners came together perfectly. The finish for this top is very specific to African mahogany. I wish I could remember where I saw the idea for this finish so that I could give them proper credit. I should also note that I completed the finish on the bottom first, so that if the client didn't like it, I still had an opportunity to sand back and start over. After water popping, it starts off with a small amount of potassium dichromate heavily diluted in water. This creates a chemical reaction with the tannins in the wood. I first tried this on the rag box for the shop and was pretty amazed with the results. This is the look that the client wanted, but they also wanted the feel of Rubio Monocoat. Frankly, I had never tried to use the two different finishes together, but since shellac would be the separator coat, I knew the two should work together. I applied the potassium dichromate, which really showed off the color differences in the boards. After allowing this chemical reaction to happen for several hours, the color difference was a lot less pronounced, but it also produced a very flat and bland look. There were a total of 4 rough boards to create the 8 individual boards in this top. Unfortunately, the colors were off quite a bit from board to board, and I was a little concerned during the entire build that I might have to completely redo the finish or even rebuild this top. Next up was a coat of amber shellac, which added a great deal of color back to the top, but it was a much more even color, which was very nice to see. Once the shellac was cured, I applied a coat of Mohawk burnt umber glaze. This coat was applied extremely heavily and nearly immediately wiped back, which seemed to even out the color even more. This was followed up by another coat of amber shellac, which added a great deal of sheen back to the surface. It really is a lesson in trust to trust a process like this on an expensive tabletop. Expense both in the lumber as well as the time it took to make. With the client happy with the overall look, now I just had to achieve the feel that they wanted. I started by lightly sanding the last layer of shellac with 180 grit to scuff up the surface. Rubio recommends 150 grit, but I've never had any issues with 180 grit. I then applied Rubio Monocoat Pure to the top with a white Scotch-Brite pad, followed by the Rubio Maintenance Oil, buffed in with a powered buffer. I followed this up with just some hand buffing again with a white Scotch-Brite pad, just looking for any excess that might still be on the surface and get that removed. Overall, both the client and I were super happy with the results of how this tabletop turned out. The base was done using General Finishes milk paint. The first coat was a basil color, followed by an antique white, and then sanded back pretty heavily. From there, a few different glazing techniques were applied, giving the client the overall look that they wanted. And then I followed this up with some General Finishes High Performance for a total of about 4 coats. I do wish I could have gotten some better pictures of this one before it was delivered, something I'll be working on in the future. Super fun project, great client, what more could you ask for? Hope you enjoyed this one, guys, and until next time, take care.